Okay, so good evening, everyone. I hope the audio is sufficient. This is our first live podcast on YouTube for the Deleuze Modeste podcast on Gilles Deleuze and Pierre Félix Guattari and much more. I think last year we tried live streaming on Twitch, but Twitch ended up just to be for gamers, and we wanted to pick it up again, just to do to share what we're kind of studying right now and look at the direction of where the podcast is going, and just giving some kind of schizophrenic look into where we are moving. So Twitch turned out to be just for gamers, so I don't think that was the proper place for us. We looked into Rumble as well. However, Rumble unfortunately has been blocked in France, and it is not usable from inside of France, and it seems to be pretty harsh. However, it would appear that the French government has been quite aggressive in passing a series of laws which are strongly ideological and debatable. I'm just going to look up really quickly. Keep in mind, this is just a completely informal live broadcast. What was the latest law? France law. And this was concerning, this is a nice one. Here we go. Let's read this really quickly. France's new law curbing anti-vaccination rhetoric or infringing free speech. The French National Assembly has enacted a law penalizing explicit anti-vaccination advice, sparking debate on the balance between public health and free speech. The law mandates social media platforms and health professionals to disseminate accurate health information, but critics argue it may infringe on individual freedoms and stifle open discourse on vaccination. So essentially, if someone were to go onto social media and explicitly give advice to their followers about anti-vaccination alternatives, that would be a penal crime and therefore punishable. I'm not sure yet to which extent the law's provision, this is the controversial Article 4, does not outright penalize criticism of mRNA vaccines, but targets explicit anti-vaccination advice. So apparently, you can criticize the mRNA anti-COVID vaccines. However, if you advise someone to either not use vaccines, I presume, or alternative treatments for COVID, that would be considered a punishable under the penal code. So that is quite questionable and up for debate. And of course, the other law which is being passed now would be, let's take a look. Mandatory let's see if I can even, man. Here we go. France to introduce school uniforms. This is for public schools, obviously. Private schools, obviously, already have public uniforms. France to introduce school uniforms in bid to reduce bullying and inequality. So France, we know, has specifically outlawed any kind of manifestation on the part of anyone regarding the conflict in between Palestine and Israel. So no one has the right to protest from either side. And I assume the goal of that is to not create an incendiary situation or whatever. And we have another law. When some French schools reopen in September this year, they will pilot a mandatory school uniform under a 2-year trial period initiated by the education minister Gabriel Attal. Attal is the new prime minister, recently appointed when Emmanuel Macron shook up his government, and Attal is very young and has apparently been thrust into a very important position of power at a very young age. One could presume with the goal of winning the next election and preventing the right parties from coming into power. But some public school teachers, psychologists, and experts remain skeptical, saying the uniforms are just putting on a plaster on such issues. So that would mean the ultimate goal is that in every public school we will go back to the 1950s, and everyone will have a white shirt and a blue jacket, possibly even a tie, and therefore the right to self-expression by the children, in public schools nowadays, they choose whatever they want, jeans, t-shirt, that would be abolished, and therefore this would reduce problems between peoples of different nationalities. It would reduce bullyism, which I'm very, very skeptical about that. And it would reduce, it just would create a purely laic atmosphere. So we are moving kind of in a direction, I'm trying to find a soft word for it, a worrisome direction, and a losing battle. One of the key arguments by the government in support of school uniforms is that they could curb future attempts to undermine French secularism. And recently, controversy around clothing associated with Islam has taken center stage. So there's our first boo-boo word. And on September 4th, the government banned long robes worn by women and girls known as abayas. They were seen as a challenge to France's secularist values, or what is known as laïcité. Laïcité is, I believe in English, laicity, being laic. The ban prompted a wave of fury across the country, with some arguing that loose body-covering garments did not constitute an ostentatious display of religion and shouldn't be forbidden. The principle of secularism in France means wearing any sign or garment that manifests a student's religious affiliation is against the law. Legislation passed in 2004 prohibits ostentatious religious symbols from public schools, including Muslim headscarves, large Christian crosses, Jewish kippas, and turbans worn by Sikhs. After letting out an audible sigh, Sabrina, who was interviewed, said she honestly doesn't think the school uniform will change anything regarding the social climate in the schools. And I would tend to agree with her. And once again, I think all of these initiatives have something in common, and I do think they're all highly debatable, even though is ideological as it is, forced laicity on all people is curiously remnant of past social regimes, and we know how those stories kind of turned out. But however, we are not here to talk too much about this. We want to just explain our podcast. Our principal podcast on Deleuze Modeste was always dedicated to a basic study of the philosophy of Gilles Deleuze and its origins, in kind of a simple way, without getting into all the radical chic terminology. And the war machine is a beautiful concept. It absolutely is, but it's kind of the name of the concept, and it was purposely made to be to have a very seductive name that just tends to lead people astray. And the war machine here, war machine. No. It's very philosophically sound, but it's just kind of been used and abused. So obviously that's the concept of our podcast, to get down to the simple basics and mechanics and the beauty of the philosophical nature, which is absolutely original and absolutely fascinating and absolutely solid. So I think for the first few chapters, every once in a while, we kind of stray off point. We did some podcasts specifically applying the concept of the war machine by Deleuze and Guattari, and going into the history of how after the anti-Oedipus, Deleuze felt that there was something profoundly missing from the anti-Oedipus, and that was specifically the concept of the nomad and nomadology. And together with Pierre Félix Guattari, Deleuze ended up meeting and interviewing Elias Sandbar, who was a Palestinian writer and poet who expatriated Paris in the 60s and 70s. And this kind of the Palestinian population, called by Elias Sandbar originally the Native Americans of the Middle East, played a fundamental role in Plateau, 1,000 plateaus, I believe. And the Palestinian people were a fundamental case for Deleuze and Guattari's concept of the war machine. However, not in a traditional sense of being just rebels, but being a population nomadic, in a constant state of becoming, a population always yet to be defined, a population that has always resisted the state. And then from there we looked into all kinds of implications, how the state must appropriate a war machine and can never trust its own war machine to found its military power, etc., etc. So the point is, every once in a while we kind of stray off onto another topic, and our last podcast was dedicated to a very simple podcast on the origins of psychoanalysis. And so we kind of veered off again, and we have also published a preview of our next podcast, which will go further into this issue of the unconscious, psychoanalytics, Freud, Lacan, Pierre Félix Guattari, Deleuze, etc., with the goal to try and understand in the contemporary world today what is left of that structure created in the beginning of the late 18th century onwards, and how do we deal with these issues today, and to what extent can we consider contemporary society in 2024 as moving further and further into a kind of a pure state of psychosis or schizophrenia, and the base of the concept of the psychosis is through the suffering of a trauma, which is be defined by different authors is different in different ways. However, if you, let's say, if you're a young child and you suffer very strong trauma, why is my camera doing that? Yeah, okay, thank you. That's better. If you suffer trauma in your childhood, which could be sexual, in contemporary thought, it could be any kind of trauma. If you overcome that trauma and you continue on with your life, obviously you interiorize that trauma and you bring it with you. But you suffer, your behavior suffers from this past trauma, and that is nevrosis, I believe neurosis, we can call that. However, if you suffer trauma and you do not overcome it, and that trauma it was too strong, or you were not sufficiently strong enough to overcome it, then you go into a state called psychosis. In psychosis, schizophrenia is the limit case of psychosis in the sense that there's a break with reality. And that's what we got into our last podcast, which essentially was just kind of a very simple 101 course on the origins of psychology and psychoanalysis. Starting with Freud, moving on to Lacan, and then we talked about Pierre Félix Guattari and his break with Lacan, and also Michel Foucault, and how through Foucault and Guattari, psychoanalysis will move from the individual through Guattari to a more societal point of view, meaning that for Pierre Félix, schizophrenia was fundamentally a communal or societal condition. And then with Michel Foucault in Discipline and Punish, you will get into the historical aspect of this, where we begin to look at early forms of control in the 18th century and capitalism, and obviously the famous example of the panopticon, and how historically a society already imposes a kind of neurosis on the individual through this very strict regulation of subjects under a capitalistic system, and obviously the necessity to repress them, but with new means, which obviously the further the capitalism expands its limits, the more these means of repression will modify themselves, unless when Deleuze published the short essay, I believe it was The Society of Control, I think he was talking very clearly about our world in 2024, where we are given kind of this highway, which seems like the digital world is, and to us it seems like this infinite creative field in which we're all incredibly free, but in reality it's just a highway where you can hit the gas, you can pass left and right, and you have all this space, and you believe you're free. However, you're free as long as you do not pass the limits of the highway. Let's say the highway has very high concrete walls, and you're going to stay on that highway, and you're not going to pass the highway, nor will you see outside of those walls. And then I think if you go to our main channel, our preview, which we recorded very quickly for our upcoming podcast, will also include sadomasochism, sakermasok, Sacker and Leopold van Masok, my apologies, and also this aspect of coldness and cruelty, which is an inherent part of capitalism, and how it captures our desire and fragments it and redistributes it. So and why are we doing this detour? Because obviously we will come back to our main podcast. I think we were still with Deleuze and Kant and the unhinging of time, getting towards Henri Bergson, which will be a whole bunch of fun, but we kind of made this detour for a variety of reasons. One is that we I personally have had to deal with psychologists a lot recently in the recent years, and it's a subject that not only am I fascinated upon, but it's also has personal roots for people around me. And so I've tried to delve more and more into psychology, and then recently I picked up, after it's been about 10-15 years that I've actually read the Anti-Oedipus, and I picked it up again a few weeks ago, and I began to see it in a whole new context after dealing concretely with psychology and psychoanalytics. I had this kind of new perspective on Anti-Oedipus, and I just rediscovered this kind of vitality in that book. So that was a good experience. And then also looking at the contemporary world today, and a lot of things that are taking place, I find it more and more plausible that we are living through a period in which there's a substantial break from reality, which has already occurred decades and decades, and then maybe even a century ago. But that rupture with reality nowadays has come to a point in which, in my opinion, following Deleuze and Guattari, contemporary society is very clearly, if not schizophrenic, in an advanced stage of psychosis, where collectively there is a trauma which has induced a kind of break from reality. And to me, it just seems completely clear. So anyway, that's the reason why we're doing this. I do not want to go on. I'm just going to take another 10 minutes here, because what I actually want to do tonight is, someone suggested to me a book originally on Lacan, Jacques Lacan, a very simple book. And Lacan is kind of a very complex character. And I find a lot of the things, he's a highly structuralist, but it's very, very complicated, even according to Freud. And some of the ideas I find, like original repression, for example, I find to be disturbing. Original repression, as we stated on our podcast, the last one. Original repression essentially means that every child in their youth, in their Oedipal triangle, meaning mom, dad, and me, and their family, before they are able to speak, they suffer an original repression, which is the cause of all of the other repressions they will suffer in life. And this is because the child wishes to be the object of desire of their mother. However, the true object of desire is the phallus of the father, and therefore the child, before learning to speak, desires to be a phallus, and then desires to have a phallus. However, their phallus will not be the object of desire of the mother for obvious reasons. Incest is forbidden, and also at that age, the child is not, obviously not, let's put it in a polite way. If it's a male, the organs, are at 1 or 2 years old, are not up to the task, let's say, and therefore this is the primal repression, which then becomes the source of the eventual learning of language and the chain of signification. So for me, Lacan was kind of a unique person, very complicated. However, this idea that we suffer an original repression before we can even speak, from a psychoanalytic point of view, I find that kind of disturbing. But obviously, Deleuze and Guattari later in the Anti-Oedipus refuted most of these claims, even though not all of them. It's a very complex relationship. But in Anti-Oedipus, the goal was to, as Deleuze and Guattari said, I think on the second page, it's better to be a free schizophrenic living with nature in the mountains than a neurotic always lying on the couch, with a psychoanalyst in front of them. And I do kind of tend to agree with that. So, but what I did want to do this evening, very quickly, was to look into this book dear friend sent to me. A very simple book on Jacques Lacan, and I love children's books, simple books, and I just wanted to get into it a little bit because Lacan is a complex figure. Lacan was very attached to Ferdinand de Saussure and semiotics and structuralism, and not a figure to be underestimated. And it is worth looking a little bit into the relationship between Guattari and Lacan, and also Deleuze and Lacan, just to if only to understand the context a little bit better of the Anti-Oedipus, and then also in contemporary society. Once again, Lacan is a difficult subject, and I did dig up here, obviously, the spokesman for Jacques Lacan in our times is our one Mr. Slavoj Žižek, who often makes use of Lacan's ideas, and also has written books, as we know, heavily criticizing Deleuze via Lacan. As we know, Slavoj Žižek is a noted Hegelian, according to his own words, etc., etc. We won't get into that. I'm just going to read a little piece that I came across here. Just understand, today in 2024, but Žižek for about 10 years at least has been going on about Lacan. This is just a brief piece from Lacan's 4 discourses. So the idea is just a little bit to familiarize ourselves with Jacques Lacan, and being that Žižek is one of the loudspeakers in today's world talking about Lacan, we'll just take a quick look at this just to get an idea of what's going on here. So this is by a small paper by Slavoj Žižek. Although Lacan's notion of university discourse circulates widely today, it is seldom used in its precise meaning. That is, designating a specific discourse, and a discourse would be a social link. As a rule, it functions as a vague notion of some speech being part of the academic interpretive machinery. In contrast to this use, one should always bear in mind that, for Lacan, university discourse is not directly linked to the university as a social institution. For example, he states that the Soviet Union was the pure reign of university discourse. Consequently, not only does the fact of being turned into an object of the university interpretive machinery prove nothing about one's discursive status, names like Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, or Walter Benjamin, all three great anti-universitarians whose presence in the academy is today all-pervasive, demonstrate that the excluded or damned authors are the ideal feeding stuff for the academic machine. Can the upper level of Lacan's formula of the university discourse, directed toward A, not also be read as standing for the university knowledge endeavoring to integrate, domesticate, and appropriate the excess that resists and rejects it? Okay, so we know that Slavoj likes to try and make things appear much more complex than they are, but I'm going to go on just a little bit. Lurking behind the reproach of belonging to university discourse is, of course, the question of the relationship between psychoanalysis and cultural studies. The first fact to note here is that what is missing in cultural studies is precisely psychoanalysis as a social link, structured around the desire of the analyst. Today, one often mentions how the reference of psychoanalysis in cultural studies and the psychoanalytic critic supplement each other. Cultural studies lack the real of clinical experience, while the clinic lacks the broader critical historical perspective, say, of the historic specificity of the categories of psychoanalysis, Oedipal complex, castration, or paternal authority. The answer to this should be that each of the approaches should work on its limitation from within its horizon, not by relying on the other to fill up its lack. If cultural studies cannot account for the real of the clinical experience, this signals the insufficiency of its theoretical framework itself. If the clinic cannot reflect its historical presuppositions, it is a bad clinic. One should add to this standard Hegelian dialectical paradox. In fighting the foreign or external opposite, one fights one's own essence. Its inherent supplement. In impeding oneself, one truly impedes one's external opposite. When cultural studies ignore the real of clinical experience, the ultimate victim is not cultural studies itself, but the clinic, which remains caught in pre-theoretical empiricism, and vice versa when the clinic fails to take into account its historical presuppositions. The ultimate victim is a theory. The ultimate victim is theory itself, which, cut off from clinical experience, remains an empty ideological exercise. The ultimate horizon is here not the reconciliation of theory and clinic. Their very gap is the positive condition of psychoanalysis. Freud already wrote that in the conditions in which it would finally be possible, psychoanalysis would no longer be needed. Psychoanalytic theory is ultimately the theory of why its clinical practice is doomed to fail. So once again, this to me is kind of an obtuse way of saying a very simple thing. And here we have a dichotomy between universities, and Lacan famously said the Soviet Union was one big university. Why? Because universities lack practical experience and practical problem solving, which the clinic, in theory, possesses because they deal directly with patients, while the discourse at the university criticizes the operative aspect from a social and historical point of view. So let's just go on a little bit further. This is just going to give us a little bit of the sense on how Lacan is being used by Zizek today. One of the telltale signs of university discourse is that the opponent is accused of being dogmatic and sectarian. University discourse cannot tolerate an engaged subjective stance. Should not our first gesture be, as Lacanians, to heroically assume this designation of being sectarian and engage in a sectarian polemic? So let's be precise on this. Sectarian, obviously, denoting or concerning a sect or sects, a member of a sect. The city's traditional sectarian divide, a Jewish sectarian who preached the redemption of the Gentiles. So, once again, we have Slavoj talking about the sectarian nature of universities. I quite possibly, almost certainly, have lost my page there. So anyway, we can. That's really of no great importance whatsoever. But already, it kind of gives us this kind of foundation. Jacques Lacan was famous in his argument with Pierre Félix Guattari, was specifically around the fact. Let's see if I can drag that back up here. Hang on. It was specifically about the fact that Lacan insisted that psychoanalysis was an individual issue and had to be done individually between the analyst and the analysand, of course, the patient. And it was Guattari who was deeply committed to the fact that psychoanalysis was a social fact. Okay, hang on, we've got that. So, university discourse as the hegemonic discourse of modernity has two forms of existence in which its inner tension or contradiction is externalized. Capitalism, its logic of the integrated excess of the system reproducing itself through constant self-revolutionizing, and the bureaucratic totalitarianism conceptualized in a different guise as the rule of technology, of instrumental reason of biopolitics as the administered world. How precisely do these two aspects relate to each other? We should not succumb to the temptation of reducing capitalism to a mere form of appearance of the more fundamental ontological attitude of technological domination. We should rather insist in the Marxian mode, that the capitalist logic of integrating the surplus into the functioning of the system is the fundamental fact. Stalinist totalitarianism was the capitalist logic of self-propelling productivity liberated from its capitalist form, which is why it failed. Stalinism was the symptom of capitalism. Stalinism involved the matrix of general intellect, of the planned transparency of social life, of total productive mobilization, and its violent purges and paranoia were a kind of return of the repressed. The irrationality inherent to the project of a totally organized, administered society. This means the two levels, precisely insofar as they are two sides of the same coin, are ultimately incompatible. There's no meta-language enabling us to translate the logic of domination back into the capitalist reproduction through excess or vice versa. This is very curious. Something hopefully we can look into a little further. The key question here concerns the relationship between the two excesses, the economic excess surplus integrated into the capitalist machine as the force that drives it into permanent self-revolutionizing, and the political excess of power exercise inherent to modern power, the constitutive excess of representation over the represented. The legitimate state power responsible to its subject is supplemented by the obscene message of unconditional exercise of power laws. Do not really bind me, but I can do whatever I want. I can treat you as guilty if I decide to. I can destroy you if I say so. Last one here. No, let's do two more. Perhaps the key to this problem is provided by the historicity inscribed in Lacan's matrix of the four discourses. The historicity of modern European development. The master's discourse stands not for the pre-modern master, but for the absolute monarchy, the first figure of modernity that effectively undermined the articulate network of feudal relations and interdependencies, transforming fidelity to flattery. It is the Sun King of Louis XIV, Louis XIV, with his L'État, c'est moi, who is the master par excellence. His hysterical discourse and university discourse then deploy two outcomes of the vacillation of the direct reign of the master. The expert rule of bureaucracy that culminates in the biopolitics of reducing the population to a collection of homo sacer, what Heidegger called inframing, Adorno the administered world, Michel Foucault the society of discipline and punish, the explosion of the hysterical capitalist subjectivity that reproduces itself through permanent self-revolutionizing, through the integration of the excess into the normal functioning of the social link. The true permanent revolution is already capitalism itself. And last one here, Lacan's formula of the four discourses thus enables us to deploy the two faces of modernity, total administration and capitalist individualist dynamics, as two ways to undermine the master's discourse. Doubt about the efficiency of the master figure, what Eric Santer called the crisis of investiture, can be supplemented by the direct rule of the experts legitimized by their knowledge, or the excess of doubt, of permanent questioning, can be directly integrated into social reproduction. Very relevant today, I believe, this excess of doubt as well by the subject, or permanent questioning, can be directly integrated into social reproduction. Finally, the analyst discourse stands for the emergence of revolutionary, emancipatory subjectivity that resolves the split of university and hysteria. In it, the revolutionary agent, A, addresses the subject from the position of knowledge that occupies the place of truth, for example, which intervenes as the symptomal torsion of the subject's constellation, and the goal is to isolate, get rid of, the master signifier that structured the subject's ideological, political unconscious. So, without getting too further into this, we're going to take a quick look into this very simple book on Lacan. And if there was any point to reading this article by Slavoj Žižek, which goes on and on, it's just to give us a kind of sense of as I mentioned before today, psychoanalysis up until towards the end of Lacan's reign, let's say, over psychoanalysis, was highly considered a private and individual thing done between the master, and the patient, and since Guattari and Foucault and Deleuze, it's in a social, political context, which will become an important factor. And what kind of being said here is that this it's not a break. The development of psychoanalysis into a form of social and historical context on one hand, and on the other hand, still the practical relationship of the analyst to his patient, are kind of have this kind of division between them. No, it's like theory and practice, essentially, and it's interesting to note how Zizek is kind of applying the recognition of this two-faced aspect between theory and practice in the modern contemporary capitalistic society, and I think most of the comments concerning capitalism, or if anyone has read Anti-Oedipus, I think, or even Michel Foucault, the rest is nothing really too new. I mean, we have the need to administer, or as Foucault would have said, to discipline and punish the subjects in a capitalistic system which is founded on excess of a surplus value. This is Marx 101, no? Profits tend to fall, therefore capitalism must always overcome its own limits in order to constantly increase profits. And so good. Anyway, that's just a quick look, and maybe next time around we can get in a little bit more into how Lacan is being employed in contemporary discourse, specifically by Zizek. But before I get into that, I think it's just good to take a very quick look and a very simple look at Lacan himself, which should make things a little bit clearer. So I'm just going to read a few snippets from his ebook, and then I'll sign out. We have born on the 13th of April 1901. Jacques-Marie Émile Lacan was the first child of Charles Marie-Alfred Lacan and Émilie Philippine Marie Baudelaire. Nice, they had very nice names back then, huh? Alfred Lacan was the Paris sales representative of a large provincial firm. The family lived in comfortable conditions in the Boulevard de Beaumarchais before moving to the Montparnasse area, where Jacques entered into the prestigious Catholic school, the Collège Stanislas, which exists today and is also known for having a lot of rich, privileged students who develop drug problems at a very young age. But I'm sure back in the 1920s it was a better place. An outstanding pupil, he excelled in religious studies and Latin. As a teenager, Jacques Lacan developed a passion for philosophy, adorning the walls of his bedroom with the plan of the structure of Spinoza's Ethics. And this is interesting, that Lacan would cover his walls as a young man with the structure of the Ethics of Spinoza, a text which would always remain dear to him and which he would quote at the start of his doctoral dissertation in medicine. The Surrealist movement. Lacan took up the study of medicine in 1920 and specialized in psychiatry from 1926. During this period, he was active in the busy Parisian world of the writers, artists, and intellectuals who made up the Surrealist movement. He frequented Adrien Monniere's bookshop on the left bank, along with the likes of André Gide and Paul Claudel, and at the age of 17 met James Joyce, a friend of André Breton and Salvador Dali. He was become Picasso's personal physician and a contributor to several surrealist publications from the early 1930s. Beginnings in psychiatry, his internship at St. Anne Hospital starting in 1926. At the Infirmerie Spéciale des Aliénés de la Préfecture de Police in 1928 gave Lacan a particular interest in the study of paranoia. Later he would say that, what would he say? My only real master in psychiatrist was Gaëtan Gatien de Clérambault. So there we have Clérambault as the inspiration for Jacques Lacan, and this is a familiar name, Clérambault, pardon, Gaëtan Gatien de Clérambault. Okay, hang on. Here we go. No, this is, there we go. Okay, Gaëtan Henri Alfred de Droit Lyon Marie Gatien de Clérambault. Once again, Gaëtan Gatien de Clérambault, born on the 2nd of July, 1872, passed away on the 17th of September, 1932. Let's look at his full name again. He was a French psychiatrist, and just think about how names once upon a time really meant something. His full name, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 names. Gaëtan, Henri, Alfred, Edouard, Léon, Marie, Gatien de Clérambault. Wow. Apart from his psychiatric studies, he was an acclaimed painter and wrote on the costumes of various native tribes. Wrote on the costumes of various native tribes. Okay, he was also a professional photographer from 1914 to 1918. He took around 30,000 photographs. Some of the photos were taken as part of a research project involving symptoms of hysteria. Many of his photos were later placed in the Musée d'Homme. He became a physician in a special infirmary in 1899 for the insane. And he ran this institution from 1920 onwards. He is credited with introducing the term psychological mental automatism, proposing that the mechanism of mental automatism could be blamed for hallucinatory experiences. He divided mental automatisms into 3 types: associative, motor, and sensitive. He considered the mental automatism to be the primary process of psychosis, while the delusional state was to be regarded as secondary. Okay, he fought in the First World War, won the Cross of the Légion d'honneur and also the Croix de Guerre, and he committed suicide by firearm on the 17th of November 1934 in Malakoff, in a commune southwest of Paris. Famously, the French psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan attributed his entry into psychoanalysis as largely due to the influence of Clérambault, whom he regarded as his only master in psychiatry. Very quickly, automatic behavior. This is a mental automatism, is the spontaneous production of purposeless verbal or motor behavior without conscious self-control or self-censorship. This condition can be observed in a variety of contexts, including schizophrenia, psychogenic fugue, Tourette syndrome, epilepsy, narcolepsy, or in response to a traumatic event. Automatic behavior can also be exhibited in REM sleep, during which a higher amount of brain stimulus increases dreaming patterns. In such circumstances, subjects can hold conversations, sit up, and even open their eyes. These acts are considered subconscious, as most of the time the events cannot be recalled by the subject. So this is what Clérambault is famous for having proposed. Automatic behavior may also manifest while performing well-learned actions. In this case, the behavior becomes automatic because it does not require conscious monitoring. So it's something ingrained in the unconsciousness. And I'm just going to look once more into the dates of Freud, just so we can sort of set up a kind of timeline here to better understand. So Sigmund Freud was born in Freiburg on the 6th of May 1856. So he was born earlier than Clérambault, and died in London in 1939. Curiously, younger than Clérambault, quite younger than Lacan. He was considered the heir to Sigmund Freud. However, Lacan's true master, as he himself stated, was Clérambault and not Sigmund Freud. So going on a little bit more, beginnings in psychiatry, his internship at Sainte Anne Hospital starting in 1926, and at the Infirmerie Spéciale d'Aliénés, I think you read that, give a particular interest in the study of paranoia. Lacan singled out his concept of mental automatism, and that's why it was good that we took a look into Clérambault. This brought together many seemingly disparate phenomena of madness under the common motif of something being imposed from outside, the echo of thoughts or a commentary on one's actions, for example. The form of a particular psychosis would then be determined by how one made sense of these elements which lacked an initial content. Lacan would say that this concept was the closest that contemporary French psychiatry got to structural analysis, with its emphasis on the imposition of formal elements beyond the conscious control of the subject. So, following up on Freud, the great discoverer of the unconsciousness, which is, as we stated, full of content, of past content, echoes, or it's a kind of outside to ourselves, in our conscious state. And Lacan was therefore very interested in structural analysis and the emphasis on the imposition of formal elements beyond the conscious control of the subject. So the attempt to structuralize and formalize the unconsciousness. Let's take a look at one more page and we'll sign off. This is a short one. We'll look at paranoia. In 1932, Lacan completed his doctoral thesis on paranoia, paranoid psychosis and its relations to the personality, a study which had a great influence on many of the surrealists. And here we have a graphic. This is Salvador Dalí saying, "I've referred to Lacan's work in the first issue of the Surrealist review Minotaur in 1933. And then we have someone saying, I often contributed to Minotaur. And then we have, I champion the poetry of the patient. aimé that Lacan described in his 1932 thesis. That was Paul Eluard. That might be Picasso saying that he contributed often to the Minotaur, the surrealist journal. So let's just get quickly into the case of Aimé. The thesis contains a detailed analysis of a woman named Aimé after the heroine of one of her unpublished novels, who had attempted to stab a well-known Parisian actress, Huguette Duflo. The case was widely reported in the press at the time, and Lacan tried gradually to piece together the logic behind her apparently irrational act. His thesis introduced a new concept into the psychiatric milieu, that of self-punishment paranoia. Lacan argued that, in striking the actress, Aimé was in fact striking herself. Excuse me. Excuse that laughter, but now we can start to see kind of a specific language, which we will find when we look over some pieces just 10 minutes ago of that article by Zizek. We can kind of start to understand the Lacanian framework, which Zizek is heavily employing. So this poor Aimé attempted to stab a very well-known Parisian actress, La Huguette, and Lacan argued that in striking the actress, Aimé was in fact striking herself. Duflo represented a woman with freedom and social prestige, exactly the sort of woman that Aimé aspired to become. In her ideas of persecution, it was this figure that she saw as the source of threats to her and her young son. The ideal image was thus both the object of her hate and of her aspiration. So poor Huguette represented the object of the hate and the aspirations at the same time as Aimé. Why hate? Well, obviously Huguette was the aspiration, because according to Lacan, Aimé aspired to be a well-known, financially independent, wealthy actress, and at the same time, Huguette was also the object of her hate, because Aimé lacked what her object of desire, Huguette, had. Lacan was especially interested here in this complex relation to images and the ideas of identity to be found in paranoia. In her subsequent arrest and confinement, she found the punishment which was a real source of the act itself. The punishment which was a real source of the act itself. So the punishment was therefore the source of the act itself, meaning that Aimé, the anticipation of an eventual punishment was the real source of her attempting to stab Huguette in the first place. She understood at a certain level that she was herself the object of punishment. She was herself the object of punishment. Lacan's analysis of the case shows many of the features which would later become central to his work: narcissism, the image, the ideal, and how the personality could extend beyond the limits of the body and be constituted within a complex social network. The actress represented a part of Aimé herself. indicating how the identity of a human being could include elements well outside the biological boundaries of the body. So, once again, the actress represented a part of Aimee herself. Represented a part, okay. In a sense, Aimee's identity was literally outside herself. And once again, I'll stop here. I'm just thinking today. I'm thinking, and I do believe that that's a very, very applicable thing today, especially in contemporary media culture, perhaps in aspirations of younger people and wanting to be, that perfect person they see on television, or the perfect woman who in reality is always photoshopped and has undergone like 30 aesthetical interventions, etc., or other gender related issues, where this object of desire of oneself, one's own identity, has been completely externalized. It's not like I'm comfortable with myself, and therefore my objects of desire might be meeting the ideal beautiful person, or what I know, traveling, or horse riding, or it's the identity as it relates to desires has been completely externalized, which is an interesting point. Anyway, I have done about double as usual, as what I should have. I hope someone has picked up something from this. I hope all of you are all well, and obviously we always thank those few followers who have the courage to follow us, and obviously none of this is nor will ever be monetized, so we are not asking you to subscribe or like or whatever. However, we do appreciate support and hope to be back here soon. So everyone, have a lovely weekend, and until next time.